The threshold bastion was not built to teach. It was built to filter. Carved into the iron flank of a captured moon and pressurized against a vacuum that wanted everything inside it dead, the station hung above the contested gulf between two dying frontiers like a verdict waiting to be read. Its corridors were poured from a gray alloy that drank light and gave back nothing, and its air carried the faint mineral tang of recycled breath that had passed through 10,000 lungs before it reached an 11th. Everything in it had been designed by an intelligence that understood pressure as the only honest measure of worth. Cadets did not graduate from the bastion. They survived it, or the station folded their names into its long, patient ledger of those who had not, and the ledger was the only monument any of them would ever receive. For 3 centuries, the Concordance had fed its frontier wars from this single throat, and for 3 centuries, the throat had swallowed the soft and the unsteady and the merely brave and asked for more. Into this place, in the 41st cycle of the Meridian Campaign, the registrar entered a designation that the station's tactical scribes would later struggle to explain. Subject classification: structurally compromised. Recommended deployment: none. Survival projection: negligible. The human had arrived already condemned by his own file. His name was Ardo Venn, and the file that preceded him into the bastion described a man assembled from failures. It listed 2 reconstructed knee joints, a synthetic plate along the lower spine, a documented history of nerve damage in the left hand, and a psychological annotation that the intake officer had underlined twice. Subject demonstrates abnormal non-response to threat stimulus. The annotation had been written as a defect. It was the single most important sentence in the file, and not one person who read it understood that. Ardo Venn was 34 standard years old, gray already threading the dark stubble along his jaw, and he moved through the intake bay with the unhurried economy of a man conserving something he was not willing to name. He did not look like a soldier. He looked like a man who had spent his life fixing things that other people had broken and was mildly curious whether this place would be any different. He carried no weapon. He carried a battered tool roll, canvas worn pale at the creases, and the intake drones that scanned it 3 times could not decide whether to flag it as contraband or rubbish, and so logged it as neither. Commandant Severith Kaal watched the human cross the bay from a gallery 40 meters above, and what she felt, though she would not have named it aloud, was relief. Kaal belonged to the Osseran people, a tall and slow-blooded species whose pale violet skin held heat poorly, and whose long history of war had taught them to read posture the way other species read speech. She had survived 4 command postings, 2 tribunals, and 1 quiet purge, and she had built her authority on the oldest currency the Bastion knew, which was fear, deployed precisely, withheld strategically, and never wasted. To Kaal, the human represented a problem already solved. She had arranged his transfer herself 3 cycles after the human had filed a maintenance discrepancy report that should never have crossed her desk, a report concerning fuel cell requisitions that did not reconcile against the manifests, a report that touched, without the human's knowledge, the precise seam of a thing Kaal had spent 11 cycles concealing. He did not know what he had found. She could not afford to assume he never would, and so she had not transferred him to a tribunal where questions might be asked, but to the Bastion, where the answer to most questions was simply attrition. She had assigned him to reliquary cohort, and in the gallery above the intake bay she allowed herself the small economy of a satisfied breath. No one assigned to reliquary cohort had completed a full rotation in 19 cycles. The mathematics were clean. The fuel that should have supplied the frontier pickets had been moving for 11 cycles through a requisition channel Cal had built with the patience of a being who understood that the safest theft is the one recorded as a routine expense. She had not stolen the fuel. She had redirected it through a shell requisition that existed only as a designation on a manifest to a broker who asked no questions and paid in the only currency the frontier respected, which was leverage. And the broker fed the fuel to the Vorn ascendancy, who used it to power an offensive against the very picket line the fuel had been meant to defend. The picket line was now a line in name only, a string of dark and powerless platforms strung across the contested gulf, watching nothing, defending nothing, a wall with no soldiers on it. And the human's maintenance discrepancy report, 3 cycles before his transfer, had touched the seam of this, had noticed that fuel cell requisitions did not reconcile against the manifests, had filed the observation with the flat administrative honesty of a man who fixed things and assumed others wanted them fixed. He did not know what he had found. He had filed it the way he coiled a fallen cable, automatically, because the discrepancy was a kind of breakage, and breakage was a thing one reported. She could not afford to assume he never would understand it. And so, she had not transferred him to a tribunal where questions might be asked and records might be pulled, but to the Bastion, where the answer to most questions was simply attrition, and the mathematics of Reliquary Cohort were the cleanest answer the station offered. The mathematics were also, as the station's scribes would later record with the closest thing their alloy souls possessed to wonder, entirely wrong. Reliquary Cohort was not a teaching unit. It was a containment measure that the Bastion had learned to point at its hardest problems. A squad of 6 alien specialists whose individual reputations had outgrown their individual names, and whose collective function was to be deployed into environments the Concordance could not afford to lose and could not afford to acknowledge. They were legends in the specific sense that legends are stories told to frighten the young, and every one of them had earned the telling. Ardo Venn met them in the cohort staging vault 11 hours after intake, and the meeting did not go the way the cohort intended. The first of them was Drenok, an Asuran of the warrior caste whose body had been rebuilt around a sensory augment that let him feel the vibration of a footfall through 40 meters of decking. He read the world through his feet and the long bones of his legs, and he had learned, over 200 deployments, that everything alive eventually betrayed itself through tremor. He felt the human enter the vault. He felt the uneven gait, the favored knee, the synthetic plate that returned a frequency no living bone should. And he felt, beneath all of it, a heartbeat that did not change when 6 of the deadliest beings in the sector turned to look at him. Drenok had spent his life cataloging the tremor of fear in other species. He had never before failed to find it. He told himself the augment was miscalibrated. He recalibrated it twice that night. The reading did not change. The second was Yelka Sorn, an infiltration specialist of the Vae, a species so quiet in their movements that the Concordance had once tried to weaponize their silence and had succeeded only in frightening itself. Yelka almost never spoke, most never. She watched with the patience of something that had evolved to wait at the mouths of burrows for prey that would eventually have to breathe, and she had learned that the surest way to understand a creature was to observe what it did when it believed itself unobserved. She watched Ardo Venn for the entire first rotation and reached no conclusion, which unsettled her more than any conclusion could have. The human did nothing she could classify. He fixed a flickering panel in the staging vault without being asked. He coiled a length of fallen cabling that no one had tripped on. He performed these acts not as displays, but as a man removes a stone from his own boot, automatically, without expectation, and Jelka filed each one and could not make the file mean anything. Soft prey, she told herself on the first day. She did not yet have the word for what she would tell herself on the last. The others arranged themselves around the first two like the points of a constellation whose shape only made sense once you knew what it was for. There was Hesh, the demolitions perfectionist of the Korabid, a chitinous people whose carapace plates clicked faintly when they were displeased, and Hesh was displeased a great deal. He had earned his reputation by placing charges with a tolerance measured in fractions of a degree, by understanding the precise grain of every alloy the frontier produced, and by treating imprecision in others as a personal insult. His pride was not vanity. It was the load-bearing structure of his entire self, the thing he had built where other beings kept a soul, and it was a wound the human would shortly press without ever intending to. Simply by being competent in a domain Hesh had believed belonged to him alone. There was Antalai, the cohort's medic, whose four-handed people, the Sethu, held the line between living and dead with a delicacy that masked a frightening physical strength. Antalai could close a torn artery with the upper two hands, while the lower two restrained a thrashing patient twice their own mass, and they had learned across a long career that the body was a system of failures waiting to be timed. They watched the human with the professional interest of a being who expected soon to be cataloging his remains and who had already, in the private ledger every medic keeps, assigned him a projected survival window and a likely cause. The window was short. The cause was the cold. Antalai was wrong about both, and being wrong about a death was a thing that had not happened to them in a very long time. There was Miro Vaunt, the rigging quartermaster, narrow and irritable, a being of the Luresi, whose long fingers and longer memory made him the cohort's keeper of gear and grudges in equal measure. He knew the location and condition of every tool, every charge, every meter of cable the cohort carried, and he resented anyone who touched any of it, because to touch his gear without his permission was to suggest that the gear could be understood by someone other than him. He had watched the human coil a length of fallen cabling on the first day, correctly, in the cohort's own preferred pattern, without being shown, and he had hated him for it, with the pure, clean hatred of a man whose only territory has been quietly trespassed. And there was Squad Mother Orun, a being of the Asuran warrior line, whose modified eyes saw heat and motion and the kinetic truth of a body before the body had finished deciding to move. Orun did not lead the cohort through rank. She led it the way bedrock leads a river, by being the thing the others arranged themselves around, and she had been the coldest toward the human for the simplest of reasons. Orun had buried more conscripts than she could name. She had learned, across 200 deployments, that learning the names of the doomed was a cost with no return, a small recurring grief that purchased nothing, and so she had stopped, deliberately, the way one stops a bleeding by tying off the vessel. She had looked at Ardo Ven through eyes that read the kinetic truth of every living thing, and she had seen a body the Bastion had already condemned, and she had filed him, without malice, without cruelty, with the flat administrative mercy of a being who would not waste grief on the inevitable among the already dead. For the first 3 rotations, the human did exactly what the cohort expected, which was to say, he failed to die on schedule, and they took this for stubbornness rather than capacity. The Bastion's training was not instruction but erosion, a sustained application of cold and pressure and exhaustion designed to wash a candidate down to the bedrock of what they actually were, and the cohort's contempt expressed itself in the ancient language of the elite, which is the refusal to slow down. They did not haze him. Hazing is a form of attention. They simply moved as if he were not there and let the bastion do its work and waited for the ledger to take his name. The bastion did not take it. On the second rotation, the cohort ran a pressure drill in the station's outer maintenance shell, a region of half-pressurized crawlways where the temperature held at the threshold of frostbite and a man's breath froze to the inside of his own faceplate. The crawlways had been carved for maintenance drones, not bodies, and the cohort moved through them in a slow, articulated line, each member folded into the cold geometry of the space. And the drill's purpose was endurance, the simple lengthening of suffering until something in a candidate gave. Hesh was third in the line, ahead of the human, and Hesh's rebreather seized. It was a small failure, a frozen intake valve, the kind the cohort trained to ignore. And Hesh, whose pride would not let him signal distress, began the slow, careful work of suffocating rather than admit a flaw in his own equipment. He had perhaps 90 seconds. He measured them the way he measured everything precisely, and he decided, with the cold logic of a being whose self was built on never being wrong, that he would rather reach the end of the count than reach for help. He did not signal. He never signaled. Ardo Ven, 4 meters behind him in the crawlway, watched the rhythm of Hesh's breathing change through the fog of the Korobid's faceplate. He did not need a telemetry feed. He had spent his youth in the orbital scrap fields of a colony the Concordance had stopped funding before he was born, keeping dying machines alive in places no rescue would ever reach, and he had learned to read the breath of a failing system the way Drenuk read tremor, by the change in its rhythm before the change in its function. He understood with the flat certainty of a man who had watched too many things stop, exactly what was happening to Hesh, and exactly how long it would take to kill. He did not speak. He moved up the line in the cramped dark, his reconstructed knee protesting the fold of the crawlway, and he reached past Hesh's shoulder and found the intake manifold by feel through the cold, his ruined left hand reading the housing the way another man's eyes would. He knew this failure. He had met it 1,000 times in the scrap fields, on rebreathers older and worse than this one, on equipment that had no replacement parts and no warranty, and no one coming to fix it but him. The frozen valve needed a precise lateral pressure on the housing, the kind a manufacturer never documents, because in a properly funded fleet it should never be necessary. The kind a man learns only by having no money and no parts and no choice but to make the broken thing breathe again. He applied it. The seized valve gave with a small crack of ice. The rebreather drew. Hesh's next breath was a long, ragged thing that fogged his faceplate white, and in the silence that followed, a silence that lasted 3 full seconds in the cold of the crawlway, Hesh turned his head as far as the space allowed and looked at the human, and the human had already moved past him to check the next rebreather in the line. He had not waited to be thanked. He had not waited to be seen. He had done the thing because the thing needed doing, the way water finds the floor. Hesh said nothing. But that night, in the staging vault, the Korobid recalibrated his own rebreather using the lateral pressure technique he had watched the human use. And when Miro Van asked him what he was doing, Hesh said only that the human's method was structurally superior to the manufacturer's. It was the first time in 19 cycles that any member of Reliquary cohort had described anything a conscript did as superior to anything. Mirovant filed a comment and said nothing. But he watched the human after that with a different quality of attention, the attention a man pays to a tool he has been using wrong. Commandant Call, monitoring the cohort's telemetry from her gallery, saw the human survival rate refuse to decay and felt the first cold finger of a fear she had thought she had arranged away. She reviewed his file again. She read the underlined annotation, abnormal non-response to threat stimulus, and for the first time, she understood it not as a defect, but as a property, the way one might suddenly understand that the quiet animal in the corner is not tame, but simply waiting. Kral had built her career on the certainty that everyone could be frightened into a shape she could use. The human did not appear to possess the mechanism she relied upon. This was not, to Call, an inconvenience. It was a structural threat to the only kind of power she had ever known. And so, she made the decision that would, in the fullness of 3 hours, undo everything she had spent 11 cycles building. She accelerated his deployment. The official designation was a graduation exercise. The reality was a sentence. Reliquary cohort, the human attached, would be inserted into the hollow marches, a debris belt of shattered orbital platforms strung across the dead space between the Concordance frontier and the Vorn Ascendancy line, a region the campaign maps marked in the gray of contested vacuum, and the cohort's own deployment logs marked in the darker shorthand of attrition. Their stated mission was to recover a navigational relay that had drifted into the marches when a Concordance picket was lost. Their actual mission, as Call understood it and no one else did, was to be in the marches when the Vorn offensive that her own falsified fuel manifests had inadvertently enabled finally broke. The fuel that should have supplied the frontier pickets had been sold quietly through a shell requisition Cole controlled to a broker who fed it to the Ascendancy, and the picket line was now a line in name only, a string of dark and powerless platforms that the Vorn could roll through whenever they chose. The human's discrepancy report had touched the edge of this. Kral intended the marches to close the question permanently. The cohort understood none of the conspiracy. They understood only that the deployment timing was wrong, that the relay recovery was a thin pretext, and that Squad Mother Orun, reading the operational parameters with the kinetic clarity of her augmented sight, had gone very still at the briefing console and said, in the flat tone the cohort had learned to dread, that the numbers did not reconcile. The fuel reserves logged for the picket line did not match the platform mass they were meant to power. Orun did not yet know what the mismatch meant. She knew only that someone had moved a beacon in the oldest sense, that the map and the territory had been pulled apart by a deliberate hand, and that the cohort was being deployed into the gap between them. She looked at the human across the briefing vault, and the human was looking at the same console, at the same column of figures, and the human said the first complete sentence the cohort had heard him speak. "The reserve mass is wrong by a factor of 6, he said. Someone is not running these pickets cold. Someone has run them empty." For 3 seconds, absolute silence held the briefing vault. Orun's augmented eyes tracked across the human's face and found no tremor, no performance, no bid for credit. He had simply read the same wound in the data that she had read, faster, and named it without flinching, and named the thing she had not yet let herself name. Yelka Sorn, in the corner, revised her classification of the human for the second time. Not soft prey. Something else, something she did not yet have a word for, but for which her ancestors, the ones who had waited at the burrow mouths, would have had a word, and the word would not have been a comfortable one. The insertion into the hollow marches went wrong in the manner of all of Call's plans, which was to say it went exactly as she intended and then continued past the edge of her intention into territory she had not imagined. The cohort's transport reached the debris belt and found the picket line dark. Every platform a dead hulk, exactly as the human had predicted. And as the transport threaded the first gap between two shattered platforms, the long-range auger, lit with the signature of a Vorn advance force already inside the marches, already moving, 3 full rotations ahead of any timeline the Concordance possessed. The Vorn were not coming. The Vorn were here, and the relay recovery, the thin pretext, dissolved into the only mission that remained, which was survival inside a collapsing belt of dead steel with a hostile fleet element threading the same debris and a chronometer that had, without anyone deciding it should, begun to count. What followed, the Bastion's tactical scribes would later reconstruct from telemetry and from the cohort's own fractured accounts, and what they reconstructed did not fit the shape of any deployment in the station's 3 centuries of records. They called it, in the dry alloy language of the after-action ledger, the march's reversal. The cohort called it nothing. They did not have the breath to name it while it was happening, and afterward, none of them wanted to. It began with the transport. A Vorn interdiction round caught the vessel as it cleared the 3rd platform gap, not a direct hit but close enough to shear the primary drive and scatter the cohort into the maintenance quarters of a dead orbital platform with their transport venting atmosphere behind them and a hostile boarding element inbound. The cohort was elite. The cohort had survived 200 deployments apiece. And the cohort was, for the first 6 minutes of the march's reversal, entirely outmatched, because the platform they had been scattered into was not a battlefield they understood. It was a derelict, a vast and complex and broken machine, and the cohort were warriors, not menders, and the platform was dying around them in 100 small mechanical ways that their training had never taught them to hear. Ardo Venn heard all of them. He moved through the dead platform the way Drennick moved through Tremor, reading the machine through a lifetime of having read machines, and where the cohort saw only a collapsing derelict and an inbound enemy, the human saw a tool. He saw the platform's dormant reactor, not dead but starved, its fuel cells drained by the same conspiracy that had emptied the picket line, and he understood, with the flat, unhurried certainty that the cohort had learned to read as a kind of weather, that a starved reactor is not a dead reactor. It is a reactor waiting for fuel. And the cohort's crippled transport, venting its drive plasma into the vacuum behind them, was full of exactly the fuel the platform's reactor had been denied. He told them what he intended in 6 words, and the cohort, who 19 cycles of doctrine should have prevented from taking a conscript's order, took it, because Squad Mother Orun, watching the human's plan assemble itself through the kinetic clarity of her augmented sight, had said one word, and the word was yes. She did not know in that moment why she trusted him. She knew only that the human had read the fuel discrepancy before she had, that he had been right about the dark pickets, that he had been right about the empty reserves, and that the cohort's only remaining variable, in a deployment where every other number had betrayed them, was the human who kept being right. Orun had stopped learning the names of the doomed a long time ago. She learned the human's name in the dark of the dead platform, and she used it, and the using of it was the first crack in 19 cycles of cold. The next 3 hours were not a battle in any sense the Concordance recognized. They were a salvage operation conducted at the speed of survival, and the human ran it the way a foreman runs a collapsing structure, by knowing which failure would kill them first and addressing it second, because the one that would kill them first was always the one everyone else was already watching. He sent the cohort into the dead platform's arteries, and the cohort, those legends, those apex predators, became for 3 hours the most lethal maintenance crew in the history of the frontier. Hesh, the demolitions perfectionist, was given the task of severing the transport's ruptured fuel line, a cut that had to part the line cleanly without striking a spark into the plasma venting around it, a cut with a tolerance so fine that a single degree of error would ignite the whole length and take the chamber with it. Hesh had spent his life destroying things. He set his charge, and for the first time in his long career, he set it not to break a thing, but to free one, and he placed it with a precision that surprised even him. And when the line parted clean and the plasma flowed where the human needed it to flow, Hesh looked at the clean severance for a long moment and felt something shift in the load-bearing structure of himself. His precision had built something. He did not have a word for what that did to him, and he did not look for one. Miro Vaunt, the resentful quartermaster, rigged the fuel transfer with the cohort's salvaged gear, the cable and the coupling and the pressure shunt, his long Luresi fingers moving through the cold faster than his contempt could keep pace with. The human asked him for a transfer line rated to a pressure the salvaged coupling should not have survived, and Miro Vaunt opened his mouth to explain why it could not be done. And then he saw the way the human had already routed the load across 2 couplings to halve the strain on each, and he closed his mouth because the human was right. And somewhere in the 3rd hour, Miro Vaunt stopped resenting the human's instructions and started anticipating them, finishing the human's sentences with his hands, handing him the tool before the human reached for it, the way a man works beside someone he has decided, without admitting it, to trust. Antalai, the medic, held 2 wounded cohort members stable through the worst of it, the upper hands working while the lower hands braced and watched the human between patients and revised the private ledger every medic keeps. The survival window they had assigned the human on the first day had closed and reopened wider. The likely cause they had assigned had become improbable. Antalai had been wrong about a death, and standing in the cold of the dead platform with a living patient under each pair of hands, they found they did not mind being wrong, which was its own small revision. And Drenok, who read the world through tremor, stood at the human's shoulder in the reactor chamber as the fuel transfer completed and the starved core began, for the first time in cycles, to wake. Drenok felt through the long bones of his legs the deep-building thrum of a reactor coming alive, a vibration that climbed from his feet, through his spine, and into the sensory augment that had defined his entire understanding of the living world. And beneath that great mechanical waking, he felt the human's heartbeat, still unchanged, still flat and steady as bedrock, in a moment that should, by every law, Drenok understood, have driven a living pulse to hammer. The human was not unafraid because he was brave. Drenok understood this now, with the clarity that comes only in the moment a long-held belief inverts. The human was not unafraid. The human had simply spent so long doing necessary things in impossible places that fear and work had become, in him, the same motion, and the work always won. Drenok had spent his life cataloging the tremor of fear. He stood in the reactor chamber and cataloged, for the first time, its absence, and he understood that the absence was not a defect. It was the whole of the thing. The reactor woke. The dead platform, fed on the transport's plasma, came alive around them, and the human turned its waking to the only purpose that mattered. He did not arm the platform. The platform had no weapons. The conspiracy had stripped them cycles ago. He did something the Vorn Advance Force, threading the debris belt in the confident dark, did not anticipate, because no warrior would have thought of it. He brought the platform's ancient navigational array back online, the same class of array the cohort had been sent to recover, and he used the waking reactor to flood the hollow marches with the platform's full-spectrum positional broadcast. A beacon in the truest sense, a roar of lights and signal across every band the dead picket line had been built to carry. The Vorne Advance Force had come into the marches under the cover of the dark pickets, invisible, certain, because the conspiracy that emptied the picket line had also blinded it. The human turned one dead platform back on, and one dead platform, broadcasting on the full picket spectrum, told the entire Concordance frontier exactly where the Vorn offensive was. 3 rotations before the Vorn intended to be seen, in the precise gap between the map and the territory that Commandant Call had so carefully maintained. The Vorn Advance Force, exposed, blind no longer, suddenly visible to a frontier that had thought itself asleep, did the only thing an exposed advance force can do. It broke off. The offensive that Kyle's manifests had enabled, the offensive that depended entirely on a dark and unwatching picket line, collapsed the instant a single platform began to watch. The human had not won a battle. He had ended one, 3 hours after a Vorn round sheared the cohort's transport, by understanding that the conspiracy's central weapon was darkness, and that darkness is the one thing a man who has spent his life making dead machines breathe again knows precisely how to undo. Squad Mother Orun, standing in the reactor chamber's amber light as the platform's array roared its position across the marches, watched the Vorn signatures peel away on her augmented sight, and understood at last the full shape of what had been done to the cohort and to the frontier and to the 19 cycles of names she had buried. She understood that they had been sent to die in the dark. She understood that the human had turned on the light. And she understood, with the part of her that had stopped learning names, that the empty reserves and the moved beacon and the impossible deployment timing all traced back to a single hand, and that the hand belonged to the station that had sent them. The cohort returned to the Threshold Bastion 11 hours later, all of them alive, the wounded stable, the transport a memory, riding a Vorn-stripped scout the human had coaxed back to life from a derelict the cohort would have walked past. They returned to a station that did not know what to do with them. The ledger had no entry for a reliquary deployment that came back whole. The scribes opened a new column. Commandant Call met them in the intake bay, and what she felt, watching the human cross the gray alloy floor for the second time, was not relief. The conspiracy did not unravel in the intake bay. It unraveled 3 rotations later, quietly, in the way such things truly unravel, when the Frontier Command that had been woken by a dead platform's broadcast began, inevitably, to ask why the picket line had been dark, and the falsified fuel manifests that Call had spent 11 cycles concealing surfaced under the only kind of scrutiny that conspiracies cannot survive, which is the scrutiny that follows being proven necessary. Call was not arrested in front of the cohort. Her removal happened in a separate room, on a separate day, through a separate door, the way the cohort's acceptance of the human happened in its own time, in its own register, and the 2 events never shared a scene, because the truth of each was too large to share the frame with the other. The human did not speak of any of it. He returned to the staging vault and unrolled his battered tool roll, canvas worn pale at the creases, and began, without being asked, to repair a sensor housing that had been failing since before the deployment, and the cohort let him, the way you let weather happen. It was Jelka Sorn, the silent one, the infiltration specialist who had watched the human longer than any of them and reached no conclusion the longest, who closed the story without a single word. She had found, in the third hour of the march's reversal, that the human had stopped to brace her against a bulkhead when a pressure surge nearly took her down a venting shaft, had stopped in the middle of his own impossible work to put a hand against her shoulder and hold her to the deck, and had then moved on without looking back, without expecting acknowledgement, the way he did everything. She had filed it. She had carried it back to the bastion, and on the third night after their return, in the staging vault, while the human worked at the failing sensor housing with his damaged left hand, Jelka crossed the vault, and she did not speak, because she had never been a creature of speech, and she sat down beside the human's tool roll, a thing the cohort did not have a word for either, a vessel of the warm, spiced draft the Vey carried only for their own, the draft no Vey had ever shared with a creature outside the burrow, and she did not explain it, and she did not wait to be thanked, and she went back to her corner and watched, the way she always watched. The human looked at the vessel. He did not make a moment of it. He set down the sensor housing, and he picked up the warm vessel in his ruined left hand, the hand the file had listed as a defect, and he held it. And the steam rose between him and the cohort in the cold, gray air of a station built to filter out everything soft. And across the staging vault, Squad, Mother Orun, who had stopped learning the names of the doomed a long time ago, met the human's eyes and held them, without the assessment of prey, without the cold arithmetic of the already dead, and held them a moment longer than any of them had ever held anything in that place. And then she returned to her work, and so did he, and the steam rose, and the cold did not touch it.